Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD Dick Simpson, political analyst, educator, former alderman of Chicago. How are you today, Mr. Simpson?
I am just fine, thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, let us talk a little bit about the 44th Ward when you were the alderman. What neighborhoods did it encompass?
It is essentially the Lakeview neighborhood, roughly from Diversey to Addison, the lake to the CTA tracks, where Polina Station is, or on out to the street of Ravenswood.
And you've been interested in political science all your life, but when you were young, what drove you to concentrate on political science?
So originally, I was studying what was called government at the time, but I was part of the civil rights movement in Texas. And then I went on to do studies in African politics. And in those days, that covered all the fields of study. We studied a particular country, but we would study art and history. We would study sociology, political science, literature. It was a broad field of study. Um, but I focused on my dissertation on comparing two African towns and their politics.
Yes, Sierra Leone. You actually went there too.
Yes, a couple of times, three now. But for my dissertation, I was there almost a year.
The political climate there, did you see corruption? Because later you were such an opponent of corruption. Did you see corruption over there and then saw how it translate into corruption in the US?
So I did see corruption there, although that was not the primary focus of my studies or my interest at the time. There were many aspects of African politics which translated to Chicago politics when I got here. But it was only when I began to deeply understand Chicago politics that I began to focus on corruption.
What aspects of Sierra Leone politics translates to Chicago politics?
Well, in traditional Africa, the chiefs are at the top. They're fat old men who run the place, very much like Richard J. Daley ran the political party in Chicago. Um, they were sometimes kindly and they sometimes gave gifts, but they were completely autocratic and in charge.
Oh, so when you saw the corruption, you and you were involved in civil rights, did you think that if there were less corruption, there would be more civil rights?
Not necessarily, but I did think that it would further democracy and justice in general, that corruption was entrenching conservative powers into the government and sort of keeping the people down because you had to be part of the corrupt system if you were going to move ahead.
You fought against redlining, and redlining is kind of aligned with special interest to keep Black families out of neighborhoods. But when you try to deal with the corruption, how does redlining connect with the corruption?
Well, it's not always directly connected unless they're payoffs, but it is still a form of injustice. Redlining is when insurance companies and banks uh, actually draw a red line around a community and say they're not worth receiving insurance for their homes or loans for their homes or businesses. which prevents economic development in particularly minority neighborhoods.
Do you have copies of those redlining maps?
There are copies printed in a number of books. They come from the 1940s, particularly, and were used originally by the federal government. They gave advice as the country was beginning to recover from World War II, essentially to banks or to insurance companies, don't invest in these neighborhoods. It's too risky.
A lot of the South and West Side neighborhoods in Chicago are still blighted. Is that a result of current redlining?
There is some current redlining, but it's mostly a result of historic redlining that prevented these communities from ever achieving fair economic development. Over time, the housing stock does decline if there's no reinvestment, if it's not improved. So the historic redlining indeed is a problem for these neighborhoods. The Lori Lightfoot had proposed a solution, which was to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in both public and private money into developing the 10 poorest communities on the South and West Side. And that's beginning to bear fruit. It takes a long time to get the money out the door, to meet all the city requirements and to get the buildings built and then having them function. But there are more anchor institutions, libraries, schools, and others in these 10 neglected neighborhoods.
What about medical care for these communities? That plays a lot in daycare. You fought for daycare for these communities and for communities that had people that needed more assistance. So how could our medical facilities being factored in and more daycare being factored into these communities as well with this plan?
One of the problems is both the medical system and the daycare system is private, not public, and they don't in general get a lot of public money for development, and they're not profitable in the poorer areas, even though the need is greater for both medical care and daycare services. When I was in the city council, to give just a broad example, of the corporate budget that we controlled, mostly from property tax money, only 7% went to health, education, welfare, and services of that kind. In the city budget, 93% went for other things. So some of them, like police protection and garbage pickup, were important. But to think that only 7% of the city budget would be for what you might call human services, I thought was a great mistake. In addition, daycare services had restrictions back when I was alderman in the 70s. There are still some restrictions, but they're not as onerous today as they were then.
What about Cook County? Do you know if Cook County could provide any public medical care to these communities? Because uh, you realize that in order for these people to work and lift themselves from poverty, they need to be able to care for their kids and get medical care in their own communities.
In fact, Cook County provides just about the only medical care through the Cook County Hospital and some of their satellite hospitals and clinics. That could be expanded only if they were able to develop other clinics and hospital sites. That's a very expensive proposition. And it probably under the Trump administration is going to become more difficult. I expect the money that goes into insurance programs like Medicaid to be drastically cut under the Trump administration. And so we will actually be going backwards. But in terms of providing for the poor, yes, some hospitals do provide some services for the poor, but they limit them. And the only complete services for the poor are the Cook County Hospital and their satellite clinics.
It seems as if the only way to address marginalized communities is to give them a chance to lift themselves out and, of course, to find work and care for their children and raise their families. Even if it takes more money in the long run, it will be essential to helping the residents of those communities.
And to our own economic development. It's somewhat parallel to the issues of immigration at the national level. Theoretically, Trump wants to deport millions of immigrants who have come here either illegally or have come here on limited basis, like the Venezuelans who have special status. That really is a silly idea because we depend on nurses aides, construction workers, landscape people, people who work in some of the basic services in restaurants and many other fields. So if we get rid of them, whatever, 1 million or 20 million of these workers, our society is going to be worse for it. And it's the same. We need to empower and enhance and improve minority communities if we want to advance in economic development in society.
You in the past, when you try to find information, I guess that was before the Freedom of Information Act was enacted. You had to go to the records departments with a yellow notepad to copy down information. And you mentioned that it was hard for you. Imagine how hard it was for the public. What information were you trying to seek, and what information was uh, not available to you that could have helped you advance your various projects?
Well, we wanted all sorts of information, but the most important was the financial information. Who was actually getting the contracts? How much were they? How efficient was the government in providing the money? Frequently, the city government is as much as 6 or 9 months late paying their bills. And that puts small businesses and certainly nonprofits in a hazardous situation. So you're quite correct. We did not have freedom of information before 1983 when I worked with Harold Washington to get the first Freedom of Information executive order. And then in 1987, under Harold Washington, we were able to pass the first ethics ordinance in the history of Chicago. And we have made some advances since then on both information and ethics. Obviously, given the corruption rates, the fact that we're the most corrupt metropolitan region in the country and the third most corrupt state in the country, you know, some people say sunshine is the best disinfectant. We wouldn't be able to curb corruption entirely, but we might be able to limit it.
When you delve into finances, there might be trust and shell corporations that cover those expenses, those expenditures. How do you dig into who is actually getting the money if, let's say, some corporation, but you don't know who is behind that corporation?
Well, there's even a bigger problem because back in the days when I was alderman, we there was a political machine governing Chicago, and it had 35,000 patronage workers in local government. And so there were 5 people in charge of picking up the garbage with a single garbage truck. Today, there are 3. which meant we were spending more on every public service, particularly because of the inflation. You had two people doing the job of one person, essentially, in the city government. And that was a vast amount of waste. Yes, the people who had to pay got the money, but we didn't get the services. If you compared us to New York or Milwaukee or any other city, you were finding that we were paying 100%, 150% more for even simple services like garbage pickup. Beyond that, there were one of the mainstays of corruption or the contracts that are given out from City Hall. The Tribune in the 19th century wrote there were contracts written with thievery between the lines. We were paying inflated prices for the goods. And so even if the company was a legitimate company providing paper clips or paper or any other service or good to the city, we were paying maybe 20, 50% more than the market would have brought if it were done fairly with a fair contract. So we were looking mainly to curb patronage, which has finally happened, and to curb crooked contracts, which have only partly been improved.
And only partly improved because of those shell corporations and trusts that prevent the revelation of who is actually receiving the money. Is that what you mean?
There is that, but even if it's a legitimate corporation, suppose it's someone who, like Hewlett Packard, is selling us computers, or maybe we're buying them through Staples or somewhere. We are still paying even legitimate corporations too much money. Most of it's connected. The people who get the crooked contracts are most often the largest campaign contributors to the mayor and sometimes the alderman. And it works even at the local level. Developers, the most common, there have been 40 aldermen go to jail since 1976. The most common reason is they got a bribe for a zoning change. Not necessarily the development in the neighborhood that the people wanted or would be best for the neighborhood, but they got a payoff. And often that payoff is very small. It might only be $500. It's a little more these days. But that undermines the good development of the neighborhood in the best interest of the people.
How does an investigator delve behind those shell companies or other companies that hide behind trusts?
We can't always get the information. When we do, it's usually from investigative journalism or from whistleblowers who draw attention to the shell corporations or the shady deals.
And if whistleblowers were to go to the Inspector General or the FBI, what kind of investigation could address these corruption issues that we have now?
So there are two different levels. The Inspector General investigates both waste, mismanagement, and corruption. And so, for instance, they may find that we're being inefficient in garbage pickup, is the example I used. And they will issue a report to the mayor, the city council, and most often to the public. And pressure will be brought that we ought to go ahead and save money by doing X or Y. Sometimes they get brought information about actual corruption, like an alderman accepting a bribe. The Inspector General isn't able to investigate that or not do very much in the way of investigation. They don't have the authority. So they give it to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney. There are several cases like that occurring currently. The Alderman Burke case, the Alderman Solis, who's testifying in the Madigan case, the Commonwealth Edison case, the AT&T case. We suddenly have a plethora of corruption cases being tried in federal court. Now, those can take years to develop because you have to have absolute clear evidence, sometimes wiretap evidence or video evidence, to be able to convince a jury to convict a powerful person like Burke or Madigan.
So when those whistleblowers have the information, should they go to the Inspector General first, or should they go to the U.S. Attorney and FBI first?
So if it's more or less a waste question, where we've got a contract that's too expensive, the widget corporation could do it cheaper, that should go to the Inspector General. Systematic inflating of costs ought to go to the Inspector General. Straight out corruption. Alderman Jones received a bribe from Mr. X, either for a zoning change or whatever. That should go to the FBI. One of the problems is neither the state's attorney nor the attorney general of the state of Illinois have an effective anti-corruption unit. Sometimes they create them, but we've not had an effective one since the Republicans were last state's attorney 30 years ago.
So is that the reason why there is more corruption in Illinois than many other states?
The primary reason is because we come from machine politics. I described a little bit of the Richard J. Daley machine. In that case, patronage workers got their job not because they were good city workers, but because they worked their precincts to get the votes for the party. Individual voters got city services based on how loyal they were to the Democratic Party. So, for instance, a street that needed repair on a block which was Republican or Independent Democrat would not be paved as quickly as the Alderman's own street. And then the last part was what we've been talking about, the corrupt contracts, and that went to the campaign contributors to the mayor and the alderman.
When we talk about patronage jobs, or even to currently waste, there is so much infrastructure that needs to be repaired the streets that there's almost an unlimited amount of work that needs to be done. Why did they just have those people work as streets and sanitation workers instead of using that labor to address the real infrastructure needs?
Well, there's some infrastructure needs we can't handle, but we can do things like water, sewers, street repair, curb repair, sidewalk repair, garbage pickup. So we provide an undergirding, but much of what we might want to see would require private development. The other thing is infrastructure is much more expensive than most people realize. For instance, you might say, well, we need a traffic light at this corner because it's very dangerous. I'm not sure the current figures for a traffic light, but they're more than $250,000. That is, if you want just a simple traffic light at an intersection, that's the amount of money you have to spend. So to put in 4 traffic lights, you're spending more than $1 million. And that's not counting the work to put it in. That's just the actual light and the wires and that kind of thing. So infrastructure is one of the most expensive things we have. A good example is we know we have way too many water lines, particularly leading to buildings that have lead in them. That's how they were put in 50 years ago. We use lead pipe. Well, we can't even, it would take the entire city budget, more than the city budget, to replace all that water pipe. And so we're replacing it at a very slow rate, given how many miles of water pipe need to be replaced. So it's partly a money problem. And sometimes it is an efficiency. What's the best way to do this? How can it be most effective?
Are these prices, the cost for traffic lights, the cost for replacing lead pipes, are these the inflated budgets that we are talking about, the inflated contracts that we are talking about, could this work be done for less money efficiently?
It might be done for a little less money, but even the basic cost is more than we can do. Remember, this year, the city budget, because of the ending of COVID funds and the rest, um, what there was $1 billion gap. There's still a $300 million gap in the budget, and the city council and the mayor are fighting over how to overcome that, either with new taxes or cut services. So this isn't a time of great plenty. In addition, I can tell you, as someone who is on the board of directors of homeless shelters, um, the city bureaucracy just in getting something done is difficult. They can't get a contract. For instance, they want us to go ahead and open a new shelter. We have the building, it's ready to open, but they can't get us a contract for 2025 until March. They want us to front hundreds of millions of dollars of operating expense and then voucher and not get paid till maybe April. Well, for a not-for-profit organization, we run 154 apartments for formerly homeless people. We run counseling services. We have clothing facility and so forth. We provide health care. That's simply more than we can do. And that has to do with the inefficiency of government, not just the cost. There isn't probably a huge, the city always pays, for instance, for homelessness. To run a shelter costs us several $100,000 more than the city is paying us to do it. They expect us to raise private money, and that's all fine and good, but we're not always able to raise it these kinds of amounts as a not-for-profit.
Uh, when you get grants, oftentimes you still have to pay upfront whatever the cost you need for a project, but then get reimbursed by the grant later, right?
That is correct. It's not upfront money as it should be. Then they could audit us and make sure we weren't stealing it or whatever. But we have to provide the service, and then we voucher the city for the service. And in a good period, that could take 90 days. In a bad period, if we mess up the vouchering in any way, we almost went out of business because of some technical problems. We had a staff change. We weren't vouchering the way the city wanted, made some mistakes. And by the time we got it all straightened out, we owed the city for more than 6 months of running a shelter for which we had gotten no money. And we weren't able in the end to get payment for a couple of months that we just had to raise from private funds. That makes it very difficult for a not-for-profit when we're talking about these kinds of numbers, particularly for a community level organization.
Is it the same for other municipalities, or is this unique to Chicago, this kind of system?
Um, it's not entirely unique. We have the same thing with the federal government, but the federal government is much more prompt in paying its vouchers.
Well, then nonprofits have a really hard time to raise private funds. It's hard for them to accomplish their mission if they have to raise money up front for all these for their vision.
Yes. I mean, the good thing is it does draw private money to multiply the amount available by public money. But the bad thing is there's so many impediments, it makes it very difficult.
What about the approved vendor system in Chicago? Does that prevent vendors that could give offer better contracts, lower prices from getting in?
Yeah, we always are caught between the need to make sure that the public money is expended properly, doesn't get wasted, doesn't get given away because of bribes and corruption, and the problem of getting the best product or service for the lowest cost.
But how does one address a problem like that to make sure that these approved vendors are being used efficiently, that the city is using them efficiently and not
Well, that's where we get into the problem of oversight. And too much of the government has no oversight. The aldermen aren't able to provide it unless someone brings a complaint to them. The inspector general can only investigate a few departments at a time. The FBI can only take major corruption cases. So it's not an easy task to make the government. Remember, we're a $17 billion corporation. We're not just a mom and pop shop selling socks on the street corner.
has anyone ever tried to address this problem, this the lack of oversight?
Yes, all the groups that are not for profit, civic organizations, think like the Better Government Association, the League of Women Voters, look at different aspects of government and try to provide oversight. But, you know, when you have 35,000 employees, as the city of Chicago does, and you're providing all this range of services, that becomes very difficult because these not-for-profits generally are small, maybe have only one or two staff members, have some volunteers, but it's hard for volunteers to do it. And the aldermen mostly want to function, want to deal with like service problems in their ward. They're not focused on the big picture of the city.
But in other words, they don't realize that the big picture of the city still affects them.
Well, they don't get reelected because, you know, they found some waste in a particular department and got it corrected. They get reelected because they're able to deliver services and they're able to speak out on major issues in the city council and get publicity.
How were you able to run against the Democratic Party machine and win?
So I was able to win because I had an army of volunteers. We had more volunteers than the party had patronage precinct workers. In addition, I ran on the platform, which was appealing to the voters in the time that the Richard J. Daley machine refused to deal with certain issues and problems. And one of the things I promised was to create a neighborhood government where citizens could be involved in directing the decisions that most affect their lives. And that's what we did when I was alderman. That was when I got reelected.
What were some of the decisions that you still remember that they made that impacted the ward?
Well, one of the main ones was we had a community zoning board, which vetted all of the zoning decisions. Zoning decisions are the plan for the community, actually drawn on a map, which says you can either build a high rise at this location, or you can only build a single family home, or you can build a six flat. The biggest single zoning decision, just to give one example, is we downzoned the entire lakefront area along Lake Michigan in the eastern Lakeview area. At the time, we had already reached the density of Tokyo per square mile, and we decided not to allow more high rises to be built. And we were successful in that, which other wards then later copied, because we didn't have the infrastructure to be able to allow wall-to-wall high rises with no other kind of building east of Broadway to the lake. So that was one example of a zoning decision of great importance that has lasted until the current day.
Great. When you had your army of volunteers, how did you were you collaborating with a lot of organizations, and you had how did you get your volunteers?
So we started with the McCarthy campaign for president in 1967. The McCarthy campaign was around providing civil rights. It was around ending the war in Vietnam, and it was around curbing what we called the imperial presidency, too much power in the hands of the president of the United States. And in the 60s and 70s, those were very powerful issues. We were also about democracy and giving, to use the phrase of the 60s, power to the people. And so, because we didn't win the McCarthy campaign, in the 9th Congressional District, where I was first campaign manager before becoming Illinois campaign manager, we got only 20% of the vote. The machine candidates got elected to go to the Democratic National Convention. But in some wards, like the 43rd and the 44th ward, we got 40% of the vote. And the volunteers were encouraged to think that we could choose our own alderman. There had never been a completely independent alderman elected on the north side of Chicago before Bill Singer won in 1969. And then I won in 1971. And a number of progressive and independent aldermen have been elected since. So we discovered in the McCarthy campaign that one of the problems was the Democratic machine under Richard J. Daley. And we turned our attention to local politics, and those ideals encouraged us to have hundreds of volunteers to work not only in my election, but Bill Singer's election, and for other candidates like John Stevens in the 42nd Ward, who almost won his election.
What kind of corruption do you see now that could be addressed?
Well, both the Burke and the Madigan trials have focused on the most powerful aldermen and state legislators who run zoning appeals practices as their law firm. We should prevent all public officials from appearing to lobby for private individuals and other units of government because they're too powerful and they're granted extreme deference and win their cases. And so Burke, for instance, had all of the many between Burke and Madigan, they had the powerful corporations of Chicago, think American Airlines, think Trump Towers, as their clients, as well as many others. So there are cases of corruption where too much political power is in the hands of a few. I also favor term limits. I favor an ordinance that's currently pending in the city council, which would make public funding available for aldermanic campaigns. In the ward where I live, aldermanic campaigns are now costing more than $1 million to win. Mayoral campaigns cost more than $5 million to win, and sometimes much more. Rahm Emanuel raised $32 million for his campaign. So there are a lot of particular reforms that would curb corruption. Basically, though, we have to end the culture of machine politics that I talked about earlier and institute a sense of politics that is for the public good.
But does the public realize that?
Well, for too long, we've had the attitude of, well, we are the most corrupt city, but isn't that cute? Isn't that funny? We can tell jokes about it. We have to be serious, and there's no one silver bullet, no one law we could pass, because we're talking about a cultural change. Part of that has already occurred because of the Shachtman decrees, lawsuits that outlaw patronage. We have begun to undermine the democratic machine. There were 35,000 patronage workers under Richard J. Daley. As I talked to aldermen and ward committeemen today, they estimate that there are only a few hundred. Under Richard M. Daley, there were only 5,000. So we've made steady progress on some aspects. There are somewhat better ethics laws. There are inspector generals in a way that we didn't have before, but we're only partway there. For people who are interested, either my book, Corrupt Illinois, or the papers we publish at the website. If you go to Chicago Politics at UIC, there are almost 15 corruption papers and almost 15 city council studies for free.
Oftentimes, in campaign disclosures, we see that aldermen are actually expending money to their supporters that help them win, and that's in the broad daylight. It's on the website, but isn't that supposed to be corruption? How are aldermen able to get away with that?
Well, they, generally speaking, can't give out money directly. The political party does provide the precinct captains what's called walk around money for election day work. But to give someone $500 to vote or even $50 to vote is corruption. It did happen under Richard J. Daley, particularly in the ghetto wards and in the Skid Row of the time, that they received actual money, sometimes as little as $5 to vote for a particular candidate. That is clearly corruption. They would be prosecuted if it were done in that fashion.
Because we've seen instances where we know that there are certain individuals that support the alderman, and the campaign disclosure, actual amounts are thousands and thousands of dollars are actually being expended to those individuals that supported the alderman. So isn't that corruption in broad daylight?
That's what the ordinance that Matt Martin has to do public funding and to curb corruption and campaign financing for aldermanic campaigns as an experiment. If that succeeds, then it would be rolled out to the mayoral campaigns and the state campaigns.
So that the ordinance is just it's not passed yet.
No, it's in the ethics committee, which is chaired by Matt Martin, but he needs more pressure on his aldermanic colleagues and the mayor to try and pass it. Mayor Johnson ran on a campaign of both good government and progressive reform, meaning social reform. He's attempted to deal with social reform, but he has not used his office, as Lori Lightfoot did, to promote ethics reform.
When candidates assign these ethics reform, well, the ethics, whatever I can't remember what it was, that oath that they have to sign. It seems as if it's not just paper. Oftentimes you still see the ethics seem to be violated, but what could people do about it?
I think well, there are a bunch of things. First, elect an alternative candidate to any corrupt person who's serving in public office. And that can be done if you focus on a particular candidate and their misdeeds. The news media would like to cover issues like ethics violations. So if you can actually prove or at least find evidence of corruption by a current official, even if it's just a conflict of interest, like the example I gave of running a law firm that appeals zoning cases, then you can get rid of a bad individual and put in a better individual. We need to put in only individuals, as both alderman and mayor, who do subscribe to ethics reform. Ideally, they would subscribe to social reform as well, but ethics reform is a basic minimum.
Are there any aldermen right now that you feel are pursuing ethics reform, like Matt Martin and anybody else?
Most of the aldermen on the north side of Chicago are in favor of ethics reform. Before Matt Martin, Michelle Smith, who was then the alderwoman of the 43rd Ward, led the ethics committee. The question is whether or not we have a majority in the city council who are willing to pass ethics legislation, and will the mayor sign it if it's passed? I think the mayor would have to, but getting 26 votes from the alderman is slow work. We've made some, even under the new city council currently, we've made some minor improvements in the ethics ordinance, but the big issue currently in the ethics committee is the campaign finance ordinance.
Why would the alderman not be willing to vote for the ordinance? Is it because they are corrupt, or is there some other reason?
Well, they mostly want to get reelected, and it's very hard for challenger to raise sufficient money to run against them. Even the average aldermanic campaign costs more than $250,000. So an incumbent obviously has already raised sufficient money, knows how to do it, has the power of incumbency, the title. They're providing services to their constituents. So most of the time, incumbent aldermen get reelected. That's been less and less true both in 2019 and 2023. As more aldermen have been thrown out of office, but it's still the incumbent aldermen don't want to give their opponent an equal amount of money to run against them.
In other words, they're not confident in their own ability to win. If they have to use an extra hedge in order to win, they feel.
Yes, their first concern is to be reelected or to get elected to higher office.
Isn't that what could we do about that? Because if
I have a phone call coming in 7 minutes, so we need to wrap up.
Okay, one more question. If the aldermen were only concerned about being reelected, how could they actually do their job efficiently?
They stick to mostly providing minimal services to their constituents to make their individual constituents happy and support them.
All right, thank you so much, Dick Simpson, educator and former alderman and political analyst. You wear many hats. Thank you so much for your time and all your information.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And if our listeners wanted to learn more about you, where should they go?
Well, I'm listed in Wikipedia. I have multiple books. The most recent one is Chicago's Modern Mayors, from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot. For related to today's conversation, maybe the most direct book is Corrupt Illinois. So those would be places. I sometimes give talks. I just did one at the Newberry Library last week. But be glad to run into any of your listeners somewhere.
Thank you so much, Dick Simpson.
Thank you.
You're welcome.